Welcome to the amazing world of automobiles, where we explore the rich and sometimes quirky history of the machine that changed the world. Whole nations fell in love with the car, the personal mobility it offered, and the jobs it created. Prosperity seemed certain for any nation able to build and sell cars, at home and to its neighbours, near and far. In this episode we look at the stranger-than-fiction rise and fall of the once mighty British car industry. Car makers were once the saviours of the British working class and became fabulously wealthy. They were made lords and knights of the realm. But soon the dream faded and withered and British cars became a laughingstock. How did this happen? And how did a once proud industry rise from the ashes once more, building high-end luxury for the mega-rich, super-fast sportsters and classically elegant tourers? Join us as we explore the amazing world of the automobile and see the best of British. The British motor industry started when Frederick Sims bought the rights to his friend Gottlieb Daimler's engine in 1893 and founded the Daimler Motor Syndicate to build motorised boats. In 1895, Harry Lawson bought Sims's interest in the engine, realising its potential for land use. Vehicle development in the UK was hard because 19th century laws known as the Red Flag Act restricted the use of mechanically propelled vehicles on the public road. A man with a red flag had to walk ahead and warn people, especially those with horses, that a motorised carriage was coming, effectively limiting the car's speed to a walk and therefore much slower than a horse-drawn carriage. In 1895, as one of many attempts to promote his schemes, Lawson and Frederick Sims founded the Motor Car Club of Britain. He and the club organised the first London to Brighton Emancipation Run in November 1896 to celebrate the relaxation of the Red Flag Act, marking the start of a motor industry in Britain. Early British vehicles relied on developments from Germany and France, but by 1900 the first all-British four-wheel car was designed and built by the Wolseley Sheep Shearing Company, later the Wolseley Motor Company in Birmingham. Herbert Austin had lived and worked in Australia for 9 years, transferring back to the UK with the company, and he remained on the board until 1933. In 1905, Austin resigned from the Wolseley Tool and Motor Company, taking some senior staff with him, and in 3 years Austin was producing 17 different models of cars. By 1913, Henry Ford had built a new factory in Manchester and was the leading UK producer, building over 7,000 cars that year. Roads quickly overflowed, and the dream of effortless personal transport dissolved into a reality that we have today, the traffic jam. Car production just about stopped during World War I as industry geared up for the war effort, employing women in large numbers for the first time. Austin's company focused on the war effort, and in 1917 he was knighted and also received the Belgium Order of the Crown of Leopold II for employing 3,000 Belgian refugees at his factories. The car business was difficult after World War I. Austin was close to bankruptcy in 1921 and a receiver was appointed. The baby Austin was launched in 1922, selling for £225, putting it within reach of customers who had never previously owned a car. Its output reached 25,000 annually by 1925, and the price was reduced each year. In 1922 there were 183 motor companies in the UK, yet by 1929, following the slump years, there were only 58. In 1929 the big names were Morris, founded by William Morris in 1910, and Austin. Between them they built 60% of the cars in Britain. In 1932 Britain passed France as Europe's largest car producer, a position it held until 1955. In 1937, the UK produced nearly 500,000 vehicles. But the Great Depression of the 1930s virtually halved demand for vehicles, and thousands of jobs were lost. Modelled on the vast factories built by Ford and General Motors in Detroit, the British car makers had huge workforces. At least the British had exports to former colonies in the Commonwealth to prop up production. Even the mighty Bentley, so beloved of wealthy playboys and aristocratic amateur racers, couldn't weather the storm. Despite winning the iconic Le Mans 24-hour race, Bentley was sold to the even more elegant Rolls-Royce company. For years, a Bentley was just a slightly cheaper version of a Rolls-Royce, but at least the badge survived. Many did not. Through hard work and shrewd manufacturing, William Morris drove prices down and sales up. He became a wealthy man and bought his bankrupt former employer, Wolseley, in 1928, and added bankrupt Riley a decade later. To celebrate his peerage as Viscount Nuffield in 1938, Morris reorganised his vehicle companies, which included Morris Motors and the sporting MG, and also Wolseley and Riley, into the Nuffield organisation. In 1939, the top producers were Morris 27%, Austin 24%, and Ford 15%. Morris was regarded as a tough but fair employer by the unions, and he invested heavily in sports and social facilities for his workers. Morris represents the archetypal self-made innovative entrepreneur, the last great flowering of British manufacturing expertise in the early 20th century. He and his wife Elizabeth were married in 1904 but had no children, so he gave most of his considerable fortune to charity. Morris established the Nuffield Foundation with £10 million for the advancement of education and social welfare. Its charter is to advance social well-being through both research and actual experiment. The foundation gives away about £11 million every year. He also founded Nuffield College, Oxford, which owns his Oxfordshire home, Nuffield Place, which was open to the public, and he's commemorated in the Morris Motors Museum at the Oxford Bus Museum. Morris has buildings named after him at Coventry University, at Guy's Hospital in London, and a theatre at the University of Southampton. But in 1939, Europe was again at war, and in Britain, everyone mobilised to support the war effort. All available factories were turned over to making trucks, aircraft, tanks and munitions. Not surprisingly, these factories were attractive targets for enemy bombers, so they were heavily defended. Austin made motors for gun turrets, ammunition boxes, magazines for machine guns, marine engines for lifeboats, and over 1 million rounds of armour-piercing ammunition. Over 500,000 jerry cans and nearly as many steel helmets were stamped out. A second Austin factory started building Fairey battle light bombers, Mercury and Pegasus aero engines, and ended the war making Lancaster 4-engined heavy bombers. Nearly 3,000 aircraft, including Hurricane fighters, were produced. Following the war, the government controlled the supply of steel, and in 1947 it was available only to firms that exported 75% of their production. With limited competition from war-ravaged Europe and demand for new vehicles around the world growing, Britain became the world's biggest vehicle exporter. William Morris was born into the Industrial Revolution at the height of the British Empire. He wanted to be a doctor, but his farmer father was neither well nor wealthy and moved the family into town, where he worked as a clerk. The oldest of 7 children, William left school at 14. The family needed the wage he could earn. He convinced his family that the future lay in bicycles and enrolled for night school classes in engineering. With £4 in start-up capital, he began repairing and then making bicycles from the family's working-class home in James Street in Oxford. He became a champion racer across 3 counties, building his own bicycles. But the march of progress meant bicycles weren't enough, and with a partner, Morris built his first motorcycle. But his partner shied away from the risk, leaving William to go it alone, learning a valuable lesson in the process: not to rely on other people. He scraped together what money he could and established a garage in 1910 and designed his first car, the bull-nosed Morris Oxford, in 1912. In 1914, a coupe and van were added to the lineup, but the chassis was too short and the 1000cc engine too small to make a much-needed 4-seater version. The engine suppliers wanted more money than Morris was willing to pay for a larger version, so he turned to America for a 1500cc engine. In spite of the outbreak of the First World War, the orders were maintained, and in 1919, 400 cars were built. By 1925, annual output was 56,000. In 1924, the head of the Morris sales agency, Cecil Kimber, started building sporting versions of Morris cars called MG. MG is best known for its two-seat open-top sports cars, but also produced saloons and coupes. From the earliest days, MGs have been used in competition, and from the early 1930s a series of dedicated racing cars were made and sold to enthusiasts who received factory assistance. This stopped in 1935 when MG merged with Morris Motors and the competition department closed down. A more modern and comfortable car, the MG-B, was released in 1962 and produced until 1980. MG was in production for 56 years, mostly building two-seater sports cars. Herbert Austin had set up in the car business in 1910, and by 1914 his 2,300 workers were making 1,000 cars a year. But Austin made little profit from its wartime effort. Demand for new cars was low, and many workers were laid off. Austin was on the brink of bankruptcy. His fellow directors didn't like his idea of a baby car to revive the company's fortunes, so undeterred, he designed it at home. Launched in 1922, the Austin 7 was revolutionary, a stylish, economical and reliable car at a low price. Car ownership was no longer just for the wealthy. From 1918 to 1924, Sir Herbert was a Conservative MP, but he never made a speech in the House of Commons. He died in 1941 at the age of 74 from a heart attack and pneumonia. In 1952, Morris merged with its old rival Austin to form the British Motor Corporation, and for years various brands would be seen on families of similar vehicles. J.K. Starley made history in 1885 by producing the Rover safety bicycle, a rear-wheel drive, chain-driven cycle with similar-sized wheels. After developing the template for the modern bicycle, the company moved into powered transport, building first motorcycles, then cars, and using the motif of a Viking longship. The company developed the Rover Imperial motorcycle in November 1902. Rover began making cars with the two-seater Rover 8, and the 12-horsepower model was introduced in 1912. Building on successes like beating the Blue Train for the first time in 1930, Rover had royal, aristocratic, upper middle class and star clients. But immediately after the war, times were tough. There was a lot of reconstruction to be done, but shortages of almost all commodities, and the cash to pay for them. Luxury cars weren't high on many people's shopping lists. Rover knew they needed a new approach to find new markets, especially overseas. Inspired by an American World War II Jeep that he had used one summer at his holiday home in Wales, Rover's chief designer Maurice Wilks sketched a rugged new go-anywhere vehicle, and so was born the Land Rover. The square bodies were constructed of a lightweight rust-proof alloy of aluminium and magnesium called Burma-Bright. This material was used because of the post-war steel shortage and the plentiful supply of post-war aircraft aluminium. Within 5 months, the first prototypes were undergoing testing, and the cars were launched at the Amsterdam Motor Show in 1948. They were shown to be hardy, and with high and low-range gearboxes and large ground clearances, there were few places a Land Rover couldn't reach. The body's resistance to corrosion was one of the factors that built the Land Rover's reputation for longevity in the toughest conditions. Land Rover once advertised that 75% of all the vehicles they ever built are still in use, and Land Rover drivers sometimes refer to other makes of 4x4s as disposables. The early choice of colour was dictated by military surplus supplies of aircraft cockpit paint, so early vehicles only came in various shades of light green. The early vehicles were designed to be field-serviced. Advertisements for Rovers cite vehicles driven thousands of miles on banana oil. The use of Land Rovers by the British and Commonwealth military, as well as on long-term civilian projects and expeditions, is mainly due to the marque's off-road performance. For example, the short-wheelbase Land Rover could climb a gradient of 45 degrees, and a feature of all Land Rovers is exceptional axle articulation, allowing them to maintain contact and traction on uneven surfaces. Come the 1960s, and the privations of the post-war period were largely forgotten. A new market for four-wheel drive vehicles was evolving, one which included leisure and recreation. Taking notice of what was happening in the USA, Land Rover started work on what would become yet another worldwide sales success, the Range Rover. Launched in 1970, here was a vehicle as robust as its cousin the Land Rover when driven off-road, yet offering a refined ride when driven on-road. The Range Rover introduced features like self-leveling suspension, a powerful V8 engine, and a four-wheel drive system that didn't feel like you were driving a truck. Still selling well over 40 years later, the regularly updated Range Rover is an icon of British engineering, which has been imitated by many other manufacturers. Top-of-the-range models pack in the luxury features and latest technology, with prices to match, but families like the space, versatility and comfort. The Range Rover was a key part of Land Rover's revival in the 1980s and spearheaded the brand's return to the all-important American market.
The Range Rover. You'll undoubtedly be seeing these exceptional vehicles on the road. Or maybe not.
Launched in 1989, just the third model from Land Rover in over 40 years was the Discovery. It was intended to bridge the gap between the utilitarian Land Rover, now called the Defender, but clearly identifiable as the descendant of the very first model, and the more luxurious Range Rover. The Discovery was both practical and versatile. It quickly became Europe's top-selling vehicle in its class, with production jumping from 60,000 to 120,000 cars a year in just 4 years. In 1997, Land Rover introduced another new model, Freelander, their take on the burgeoning market for lightweight, lifestyle four-wheel drives. It was the first monocoque Land Rover, where the body is also the chassis instead of having a separate body bolted to a chassis like a truck or a horse-drawn cart. Mounting the engine left to right kept the vehicle small and maximised passenger space, and from the very beginning it was engineered for off-road performance. By now, electronic driver aids were appearing on mid-market cars, and the Freelander was the first Land Rover fitted with hill descent control. Power came not from the lusty old four-cylinder or the muscular but thirsty V8, but from new, cleaner, greener and leaner petrol and turbo diesel engines, lighter, more powerful and more efficient than ever before. In 1937, Britain provided 15% of world vehicle exports, and by 1950, Britain provided over half of the world's exported vehicles. But by 1952, the American-owned Ford and GM had 29% of the British domestic market between them, topping the share of Britain's two major manufacturers. William Morris agreed to merge with Austin to form the British Motor Corporation, commanding 40% of the British market. Meanwhile, German production was increasing. By 1953, it exceeded that of France. By 1956, it had overtaken Britain. The first chairman of BMC was Morris himself, but he was replaced within months by Austin's Leonard Lord. While the combined Morris-Austin conglomerate was the UK's largest car maker, it offered outdated vehicles such as the Morris Minor, introduced in 1948, and the Austin Cambridge and Morris Oxford, with no planned replacements for the elderly designs. The lack of development of new mass-market models meant no new cars to compete with rivals such as Ford's Escort and Cortina. The Harold Wilson Labour government came to power in 1964, at a time when British manufacturing was facing more modern, more efficient factories in Europe and the Far East, making better products for less money. The UK government decided to promote even more mergers in the motor industry. A bold move combined most of the remaining independent British vehicle makers, including car, bus and truck manufacturers, construction equipment, even refrigerators and metal casting companies. In all, nearly 100 different companies. However, industrial relations problems, ineffectual management and product duplication plagued the company until it was nationalised. Union leader Derek Robinson had greater control over BL than its senior managers, and between 1978 and 79 he was accused of causing 523 walkouts, costing an estimated £200 million in lost production. The Labour government ran out of patience with Robinson in 1979 and appointed South African-born corporate troubleshooter Sir Michael Edwards. And Edwards began a ruthless programme of factory closures and sell-offs.
It's very important to BL. They desperately need to get their market share up above 20%, which I think the Montego will achieve, in order to establish themselves as a viable volume manufacturer. If they can produce something like 500,000 or 600,000 cars a year, they can start to make money.
In 1979, Edwards made a deal with Honda to share the development and production of a new mid-sized car, the Triumph Acclaim or Honda Ballard. The new car combined Honda engine and transmission designs with a British body. The Japanese bought modern methods, including robotic assembly lines. Company fortunes took a rise with the Austin Metro, a three-door hatchback, a modern and practical alternative to the iconic but aging Mini. This would be one of the most popular cars in Britain in the 1980s. A rationalisation of the model ranges also took place, and in 1982 most of the car division became the Austin Rover Group, marking the end of the Morris and Triumph marques. But the car industry was still owned by the British government, and it was largely hamstrung by political short-sightedness.
I think they're very definitely at risk. I think they're at risk if the government just waffle on it and don't sort of make up their minds on the issues anyway. Let me sort of draw a slight parallel. There have been occasions when there have been disputes in the company where the unions have been accused of affecting the market share. And it's perfectly true that you can see the results of disputes on market penetration graphs. Now, if that can happen with the possibilities that arise from, shall we say, a 5-day strike in one of the plants, not all of them, just one of them, what on earth is the government's lack of determination doing on market share?
It wasn't just the trade unionists who were concerned. Traditional government supporters also supported a call for decisions. Margaret Thatcher became Britain's first female Prime Minister, promising to break the trade union stranglehold on British industry. Along the way, she was invited to examine the new Austin Maestro.
Just try the ignition. Please note we're all belted up. It's a very, very good car, and I just hope you will really buy it. Helps to buy British right now.
Honda's deal with Rover saw several designs shared between them. The venture ended in 1994 when Rover was sold to BMW. For the first time in nearly a century, Britain didn't have an independent mass production car maker. The new MG V8 was described at the time as an MG on steroids. It was good for 135 miles an hour. The performance is not without its penalties. The original MGB cost under £1,000 in 1962, but the V8 went on sale at over £26,500. The new model was more than just a revival of a famous badge. For over a decade, the famous 8-sided emblem was only seen on sedate sedans. But with a new open-topped car, enthusiasts could finally buy what many regarded as a real MG again.
Time was a sports car, and this is what we have now in the MG RV8. We're very pleased indeed.
Interest in small roadsters increased in the 1990s thanks to Mazda's MX-5, and in 1992 MG created an updated version of the old car. The boot lid and doors were shared with the original, but the engine was the aluminium 3.9-litre Rover V8. Largely due to the rear drum brakes and rear leaf springs, seen as too old-fashioned for a performance car, the RV8 wasn't popular with road testers. The flagship MG was produced at the rate of 15 a week. Over 3/4 of the 2,000 ever built were sold in Japan. Having revived MG in 1995 with the MG-F and strengthened Land Rover's position, BMW controversially sold off the Rover Group in May 2000. It retained the rights to the new Mini while selling Land Rover to Ford, and MG and Rover were sold to the Phoenix Consortium, who renamed them MG Rover. For the first time in 6 years, Britain again had an independent mass car maker. MG Rover sought joint ventures to develop a new range of cars, but links with foreign companies, including Malaysian car maker Proton, failed to materialize. In 2004, the Chinese Shanghai Automobile was interested in taking over MG Rover, by now hundreds of millions of pounds in debt. Talks broke down and the firm went into receivership in April 2005 with a loss of nearly 6,000 jobs. Once, MG Rover produced some of the most stylish cars in the country, but when the company revealed a loss of almost £80 million in a single year, the future looked bleak. Worldwide sales were falling and the prospects of reducing further losses were poor. When it was announced that the aptly named Phoenix Group would take over the company, Rover workers celebrated a reprieve. But while the hometown brands limped from crisis to crisis, Honda, having been unceremoniously dropped when BMW came along, built a factory in Swindon and was building cars at a furious pace.
Customers know there are more modern, more competitive cars out there. MG Rover's looking to do a deal with a big Chinese company which would bring extra investment into the company, would allow them to start developing these new models and bring them to market. Well, that's going to take some time.
But time was the one thing that wasn't available. And once the deal with Shanghai Automobile failed, the factory was facing a very real threat of closure. Workers, their families and MG enthusiasts gathered at the factory in a show of solidarity.
It's British cars, it's British manufacturing, it's British industry.
All the racing heritage they've got and they're going to have. Get behind it and support it, simple as.
The company had survived longer than most industry insiders had predicted. But without a cash injection of Chinese money, it wasn't going to be able to steer itself out of trouble. With production at a standstill, the workers were sent home. The beleaguered British government couldn't bail out the company, and with no chance of a last-minute reprieve, workers returned to the factory to pick up their tools.
It's always in the back of your mind, but I thought I wouldn't see this day, yeah, to be honest.
The collapse of negotiations wasn't unexpected, but when it happened, it left 5,000 workers out of a job.
We build good cars, we've always built good cars, and the public should have stuck with us, bought the produce that we're good at building, and they've let us down. Everybody's let us down.
As the workers cleared out their personal belongings, the grim-faced administrators began the lengthy task of assessing what could be sold off to pay some of the company's huge debts. With Shanghai's interest off the table, there was no longer any justification for further borrowings to keep the factory running. The closure came as a massive blow to the local economy, so serious that the then Prime Minister Tony Blair and his Chancellor Gordon Brown toured the area and announced emergency aid for those most affected.
There's no point in me trying to pretend that we can put together some magic deal to get another company to come in and take it over. If we could do it, believe me, we would have done it. We weren't able to do that. What we can do now is do our level best for people for the future and to protect them through a period that's going to be very, very anxious and very, very worrying for them, for their family.
About 1,000 partially complete cars remained in the factory, and a few workers returned to clear the final units off the halted production line, the end of the line for the last British-owned volume car maker in Britain. 3 months later, the firm's assets were bought by another Chinese car maker, Nanjing Automobile Group, and a workforce of 250 began production of the MG-TF, launched in 2008. While the mass production of British cars lurched from feast to famine and into oblivion, some of the small specialist firms stayed resolutely in business, thanks to loyal customers and workers. One such is Aston Martin. Despite damp conditions, the Royal Windsor Festival of Aston Martin was held in 2005. 300 Aston Martins paraded past the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh in the quadrangle of Windsor Castle and raised over £50,000 for the Prince Philip Trust. Over 10,000 people gathered for the parade of cars from the Aston Martin Owners Club on its 70th anniversary. It took an hour for the cars to drive past the Royals, with rain drizzling down the entire time. Aston Martin was founded in 1913 and produced their first car in 1915, but production couldn't start because of World War I. After the war, the company was reformed and a new car carried the Aston Martin name. About 55 cars were built, but the company went bankrupt in 1924 and was bought by Lady Charnwood. The company failed again in 25, the factory closed in 26, and wealthy investors, including Lady Charnwood, took control. Car production was on a small scale, and by World War II only about 700 had been made. During the war, Aston Martin made aircraft parts. In 1947, industrialist Sir David Brown bought the company, and 1950 saw the introduction of cars bearing the initials DB. Ian Fleming made the DB Mark III famous in his James Bond novels, but when the movie Goldfinger was made, Bond was driving a DB5. Despite the cars appreciating in value, the company was often in financial trouble and was sold in 1972. 3 years later, the company was resold after another bankruptcy. A successful turnaround saw the recruitment of 360 new workers and a trading profit. In 1980, Aston Martin had planned to buy MG as a little sister mark building smaller sports cars. More recently, Aston Martin has been owned by Ford and was recently sold to motorsport millionaire David Richards. Aston Martin collected John Sinders and 2 Kuwaiti investment companies. From 1969 to 72, Aston's flagship model was the DBS V8, hailed as the world's fastest 4-seater production car. The body was a modern revision of the traditional Aston Martin look, with squared-off grille and 4 headlights. Though the body and name was shared with the 6-cylinder DBS, the V8 sold for much more and delivered more too. Powered by Aston Martin's own 5.4-litre all-aluminium V8 engine, the new car could reach 275 kilometers an hour. New aerodynamic front underpanelling was the result of research in wind tunnels to ensure stability at speeds in excess of 240. Other new features included ventilated disc brakes, light alloy cast wheels, wide radial tyres, and a choice of manual or automatic gearboxes. In 1972, the smaller engine was dropped from the range and the DBS V8 became simply the Aston Martin V8. Almost 4,000 cars were built in 5 variants before production ceased in 1989. In 1980, Aston revealed a futuristic car dubbed the Bulldog, suggesting it would go into limited production for £130,000. Power came from a 5.3-litre twin-turbo V8, and the Bulldog achieved a verified top speed of 307 kilometers an hour, but the theoretical top speed was estimated at 381.
Any other manufacturer will ever build a motor car of this quality and type again, and I doubt very much that we shall. The world is moving away from this sort of thing, so it probably is the ultimate supercar and probably the last ultimate supercar.
Aston claimed the car was to showcase technical know-how, but it was rumoured the Bulldog was ordered by an oil-rich sheikh. When he changed his mind, Aston adopted the project as their own. Bulldog was sold to the Middle East and spent some time in the US before returning to Britain with an all-new green paint job. The modern Aston Martin cars are unashamedly expensive, high-performance sports cars. 6-litre V12 engines derived from the DB9R racing car are tuned to deliver significant power for road use with a choice of a 6-speed manual or Touchtronic 6-speed automatic gearbox. A low curb weight of around 1,600 kilograms combined with the engine help modern Astons accelerate from rest to 100 kilometers an hour in under 4 seconds and reach top speeds of over 300. There are 2-seaters and 2+2s in coupe or cabrio bodies. The 2-seater coupe has a bonded aluminium chassis and is made of magnesium alloy, carbon fibre composite and aluminium. Interestingly, there was a DB7 and a DB9, but no DB8, as it was feared buyers might assume the engine was merely a V8 instead of the V12. William Lyons was, in 1922, a co-founder of the Swallow Sidecar Company, maker of motorcycle sidecars. He would become Sir William in 1956, knighted for services to the British motor industry. The SS Jaguar name first appeared on a 2.5-litre saloon in 1935, sports models of which were the SS90 and SS100. The Jaguar name was applied to the whole company in 1945, when the SS was dropped to avoid confusion with Nazi Germany's SS military unit during World War II. A big breakthrough for Jaguar was the launch in 1948 of the XK120 sports car. The 120 referred to its 120 mile/h top speed, faster with the windscreen removed, making the XK120 the world's fastest production car at the time of its launch. The first 242 cars, all hand-built between late 1948 and early 1950, had aluminium bodies on wooden frames. The car had originally been intended as a short production model of about 200 vehicles as a test bed for the new engine until its intended home, the new Mark 7 saloon, was ready. XK120 production continued until 1954. It was followed by the XK140, the XK150 and the E-Type, keeping Jaguar in the sports car market. After their success at Le Mans in the 1950s, Jaguar's defunct racing department used D-Type style methods to build a road-going sports car to replace the XK150. The E-Type was first shown to the public as a two-seater coupe and convertible. On its release, Enzo Ferrari called it the most beautiful car ever made. The first E-Type was introduced in March 1961. The 3.8-litre engine was increased to 4.2 litres in 1964. An open 3.8-litre car at a top speed of 149.1 miles an hour and went from rest to 60 miles an hour in 7.1 seconds. A new 5.3-litre 12-cylinder Jaguar engine was introduced in 1971, available only as a convertible and a 2+2 coupe. In total, over 72,500 E-Types were built. The Jaguar XJS was a luxury tourer which replaced the legendary E-Type in September 1975. Jaguar's timing was not good. The car was launched in the wake of a fuel crisis, and the market for a 5.3-litre V12 Grand Tourer was small. The styling was criticised, especially the flying buttresses behind the windows, which restricted rearward vision and conflicted with safety regulations. German authorities refused the model type approval. Over 115,000 were built during a 21-year production life. Ford took Jaguar over in 1989 and turned the loss-making company around, but demand for high-end cars like Jaguars can be fickle. In 1999, Jaguar became part of Ford's new Premier Automotive Group, along with Aston Martin, Volvo Cars and Land Rover. In nearly 20 years of ownership, Jaguar never earned any profit for its American parent. Derived from and replacing the Jaguar XJS, the Jaguar XK series was introduced at the Geneva Motor Show in 1996 and became the first 8-cylinder vehicle produced by Jaguar. The 1997 XK was available with either a supercharged or naturally aspirated 4-litre 6-cylinder engine, and the supercharged variant is known as the XKR. An example of pooled resources with Ford's Premier Automotive Group, the first generation XK series shared its platform with the Aston Martin DB7. After a complex process, Tata Motors of India agreed to buy Jaguar and Land Rover from Ford in March 2008 for £1.7 billion. Tata builds the iconic Nano, which at about $2,300 is the cheapest car in the world. Tata is the 19th largest car maker and the second largest commercial vehicle maker in the world, based on 2007 figures. Included in the deal were 3 other British brands, Jaguar's sister mark Daimler, as well as 2 Dorman brands, Lanchester and Rover. Lotus has been making innovative sports and racing cars since 1952. The company designs and builds race and production cars of lightweight and high performance. The Europa was a 2-door mid-engined car built from 1966 to 1975. The first cars were delivered in France in February '67. Fitted with a modified Renault 1500cc engine and a 4-speed gearbox. Lotus turned the engine and gearbox through 180 degrees to accommodate the Europa's mid-engine layout. The car evolved and improved throughout its life, getting a twin-cam Ford engine that nearly doubled power output. Over 9,200 Europas were built. The Elise, like the Europa before it, is a 2-seater rear-wheel drive mid-engine sports car released in 1996. The Elise weighs 725 kilograms and is capable of 240 kilometers an hour. It was named after Elisa, granddaughter of Romano Artioli, Lotus chairman at the time. Lotus had a long history in Formula One, winning 6 Drivers' World titles in 3 decades of competition, with drivers like Graham Hill, Jim Clark and Emerson Fittipaldi. Jochen Rindt became the sport's only posthumous champion in a Lotus, and as the team began to slide towards obscurity, their last 5 victories were all scored by rising star Ayrton Senna. The team never recovered from the sudden death of charismatic founder, designer and innovative engineer Colin Chapman. His ideas included the introduction of monocoques, 4-wheel drive, aerodynamics and gas turbine power to Formula One racing. The Lotus Elise is a latter-day reincarnation of the Europa and true to the ideals of Colin Chapman. In 1986, the company was bought by General Motors. 7 years later, GM sold it for £30 million to Italian businessman Romano Artioli, who also owned Bugatti. In 1996, a majority share in Lotus was sold to Proton.
Lotus is very proud to cooperate with a company like Proton that invests to offer to the people some special technology, emotion, passion, and also one fantastic opportunity to drive cars that they are at the top of the range of the car product.
For a more traditional look and feel, there's nothing quite like a Morgan. The style hasn't changed in decades. All the cars are assembled by hand, and the waiting list for a car is usually 1 to 2 years, although it has been as high as 10. The company was founded in 1909 by HFS Morgan, building tiny 3-wheeled racing cars using motorcycle engines. HFS ran the company for 50 years, and Peter, his son, ran the company until a few years before his death in 2003. The company is now run by Charles, Peter's son. In the 1930s, Morgans were winning championships and setting world records, and the skills developed building racing cars then are still applicable today. There are no robots in the Morgan factory. The cars are built by craftsmen. The body's frame is made from wood, just like it was 50 years ago. Morgan has built a reputation for standing by the old methods, and the firm is proud that it has never suffered a strike. Though Morgans are simple, they're not cheap. Long waiting lists for new ones mean that used Morgans are quickly snapped up, and they hold their prices very well. Almost half the factory's production is exported, and there are no plans to change this winning formula anytime soon. The Morgan Plus 4 was introduced in 1950 and saw a variety of engines, but was suspended in 1969, brought back in 1985 with a Fiat and then a Rover engine. Production was cut again in 2000 and returned in 2004 with a 155 horsepower Ford engine. With a decreasing availability of large 4-cylinder engines, Morgan began fitting the Rover V8 in 1968, calling these cars Plus 8s. In 2000, the Aero 8 was introduced with a BMW V8 engine in a car weighing less than a BMW Z4. It's even faster than the Plus 8, delivering supercar performance. The Aero 8 has a top speed of over 170 miles an hour and can do 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds. The creation of senior GM executive John DeLorean, few cars have quite so colourful a history as those bearing his name, despite all being grey. Made famous as the time machine in the Back to the Future movies, the unpainted stainless steel car was ahead of its time and became mired in real-life drama. DeLorean left GM to build a Lotus-designed car in a factory established in Northern Ireland with around £100 million of British government money. The DeLorean's body featured gull-wing doors and used a V6 engine developed by Peugeot, Renault and Volvo. The factory started making cars in early 1981, but the company was in receivership a year later. It built around 9,200 cars over 21 months before the British government shut it down in November 1982. Today, about 6,500 DeLoreans still exist. The cars were intended for the American market, despite being built in Northern Ireland, so all production models were left-hand drive. Only 17 right-hand drive DeLoreans were ever built. The US government tried to lure DeLorean into trafficking cocaine, but he defended himself, showing that his alleged involvement was entrapment by federal agents. There is no more famous British car company than Rolls-Royce, and it was Henry Royce who designed and built what are still regarded as the best motor cars in the world. Royce died in 1933, but the cars he created and those built since have set the standard for engineering excellence, luxury and quality. Royce formed a partnership with Charles Rolls in 1904 to build and sell the cars that Royce had already started building. In 1910, Rolls became Britain's first aviation fatality. Rolls-Royce built aircraft engines from the earliest days, and their power, endurance and performance was recognised in Royce's knighthood, though he never ever called himself Sir Henry, and signed letters simply as H. Royce, mechanic. His personal motto was, "Whatever is rightly done, however humble, is noble." In 1912 he had an operation and was given just months to live. He survived another 21 years, and on the day he died was designing a new shock absorber. Royce insisted on high-quality craftsmanship in every part of his cars, and to this day much of the skilled work is done by hand. Testing was rigorous and inspection painstaking, but each new car that eventually rolled out the factory door was as close to perfection as possible. The roll call of owners of the best car in the world include the rich, the famous and the powerful from all around the globe. A Rolls-Royce was a status symbol from Hollywood to Moscow. Joseph Stalin had two, and cars were often customized to suit outlandish requests from wealthy owners. Rolls-Royce bought Bentley in 1931, and for years the two brands shared many parts and were built side by side to the same exacting standards, with Bentley the more sporting and Rolls-Royce the more luxurious. Today, both these British icons are owned by German companies, Bentley by Volkswagen and Rolls-Royce by BMW. The famous mascot, the Spirit of Ecstasy, is said to have been modelled on the illicit lover of one of Rolls-Royce's earliest patrons, Lord Montague of Bewley. Eleanor Thornton drowned when their ship was torpedoed in 1915. Their love affair is the subject of a movie by Lord Attenborough. To be considered for a job actually building the most famous British car of them all is a considerable honour, and once employed, few craftsmen willingly resign, so personal appearance, including a tie, reflects the prestige of working for Rolls-Royce. The very last car to be built at the factory in Crewe was escorted off the premises by the original, priceless, 1907 Silver Ghost. Since 2003, Rolls-Royces have been built at a new factory in Goodwood. Cars like this Drophead Coupe, or two-door, four-seater convertible version of the Big Phantom. Powered by a 6.75-litre V12 engine, the car is available in 44,000 different colours and has a stainless steel bonnet. The production car is very close to the 100EX concept car, built to canvass public opinion of a convertible Phantom. In its first year of production, 253 of them were built. Nowadays, the Phantom bodies are actually made in Germany and sent to the airy new British factory for assembly. The production line moves microscopically slowly, and most of the finishing work is still done the old-fashioned way, by hand. In the 1920s, British racing Bentleys, driven by wealthy amateur racers, won the prestigious Le Mans 24-hour race 3 times in quick succession. Riding the wave of patriotic fervour and the plaudits of beating the world, Bentley produced a massive 8-litre car. Their timing was disastrous.
This car was launched for the 1930 season, absolutely at the time of the stock market crash. It had been conceived obviously as the wave was going up, came out on the crest of the wave, and the marketing of it, of course, came after the wave had started to go down.
Just 100 8-litre Bentleys were built, and while they are now worth a great deal of money, Bentley went broke and was bought by Rolls-Royce. An 8-litre engine was fitted to a significant racing Bentley in 1931. Known as Old Number 1, and the car which led the winning team to a 1-2-3 finish at Le Mans in 1929, the car was the subject of a court case which established its authenticity and its value, about £10 million. More recently, Bentley has returned to its roots as part of the vast Volkswagen empire, once again building magnificent grand touring cars. Able to draw on the expertise of engineers and suppliers to Audi, Lamborghini and Bugatti as other members of the VW group, Bentley has come out of the shadows of former owner Rolls-Royce. Modern Bentleys are big, luxurious, fast and undeniably indulgent. Still meticulously assembled in Britain by British craftspeople, men and women, and with a full order book and a lengthy waiting list, perhaps it is Bentley which now represents the best of Britain.